In a quiet suburban neighborhood where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns seemed to whisper stories of peace and harmony, one woman stood out like a sore thumb. Her name was Karen Thompson, and she wasn't just another neighbor. She was the unofficial ruler of the Homeowners Association, HOA. To some, she might have appeared friendly or even helpful, but those who knew her well understood that beneath her polite smile lay an insatiable need for control. Karen's reputation preceded her. She had eyes everywhere, or so it felt. Whether it was someone painting their front door a shade darker than allowed by the HOA guidelines or leaving trash cans visible from the street overnight, nothing escaped her notice. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages to other board members about infractions, real or imagined. It wasn't uncommon to see her walking briskly down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes as if she were conducting a military inspection rather than strolling through a residential area. But lately, Karen's focus had shifted to one particular house, 24 Maple Lane. The home belonged to Evan Carter, a man who kept to himself and rarely interacted with his neighbors. When he first moved in 2 years ago, people noticed how different he seemed compared to others on the block. For starters, Evan didn't attend HOA meetings or participate in community events. He didn't host barbecues or decorate his porch for holidays. Instead, he spent most of his time indoors or tending to his backyard, which quickly became something of a mystery. At first glance, Evan's yard looked ordinary enough, a patch of green grass bordered by neatly trimmed shrubs. But over time, things began to change. One day, tall hedges started appearing along the edges of his property, blocking the view into his backyard. Then came wooden trellises covered in climbing vines, followed by colorful flower beds bursting with life. Neighbors couldn't help but wonder what exactly Evan was doing back there. Was he growing vegetables, experimenting with exotic plants, or was there something more secretive going on? Karen, of course, couldn't resist digging deeper. At first, her curiosity stemmed from professional duty, or at least that's what she told herself. After all, the HOA handbook clearly stated that fences and hedges must not exceed 6 feet in height without prior approval. Yet as weeks turned into months, Karen's interest grew beyond mere rule enforcement. There was something about Evan's aloofness that irked her. Why wouldn't he engage with the community? What was he hiding behind those towering green walls? Her suspicions deepened when she spotted Evan carrying bags of soil, gardening tools, and even strange-looking equipment into his backyard late at night. Once, she swore she saw him unloading what looked like irrigation pipes from his car. Another time, she thought she heard faint humming sounds coming from his property after dark. None of this made sense to Karen, whose world revolved around predictability and order. To her, Evan's actions weren't just unusual, they were downright suspicious. Determined to get answers, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She began documenting Evan's comings and goings, snapping photos whenever she could catch him outside. She peeked through gaps in his hedge, trying to glimpse whatever secrets lay hidden within. On several occasions, she even knocked on his door under the pretense of welcoming him to the neighborhood or offering baked goods. But Evan always responded politely yet briefly, never inviting her inside or giving away any clues about his private life. Frustrated but undeterred, Karen escalated her efforts. She filed multiple complaints with the HOA board, alleging that Evan's hedges violated height restrictions and obstructed the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. She argued passionately during meetings, pointing out how his lack of transparency set a dangerous precedent for other homeowners. "If we let this slide," she warned dramatically, "what's next? People building fortresses in their backyards?" Despite her theatrics, the board remained skeptical. Evan's hedges were indeed taller than permitted, but they posed no immediate threat to anyone. Besides, he hadn't caused any disturbances or broken any major rules. Still, Karen refused to back down. If anything, her determination only intensified. She convinced herself that uncovering the truth about Evan's yard was her moral obligation, not just as an HOA member, but as a concerned citizen. And so, Karen devised a plan. Early one Saturday morning, while most of the neighborhood slept, she borrowed a ladder from her garage and marched toward Evan's property. Her goal was simple: climb high enough to peer over the hedge and finally see what he'd been hiding all this time. Little did she know, however, that Evan had anticipated such an intrusion long before she ever arrived. Unbeknownst to Karen, Evan wasn't your average homeowner. Before moving to Maple Lane, he had worked as an engineer, designing complex systems for various industries. His meticulous nature extended far beyond his career. It permeated every aspect of his life, including his beloved garden. Over the past 2 years, Evan had transformed his backyard into both a sanctuary and a fortress, a place where he could indulge his passion for botany without fear of unwanted visitors. The hedges surrounding his property weren't merely decorative. They served as the first line of defense against prying eyes. Beneath them lay a network of motion sensors, strategically placed to detect movement along the perimeter. Cameras disguised as birdhouses captured footage of anyone approaching too closely. Even the pathway leading up to his fence featured subtle deterrents designed to discourage trespassers without causing harm. Evan had implemented these measures not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Living alone, he valued his privacy above all else. And given Karen's relentless snooping, he knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something drastic. So he prepared accordingly, ensuring that anyone foolish enough to invade his space would face consequences, albeit harmless ones. As Karen approached his property that fateful morning, clutching her ladder with grim determination, Evan watched silently from his kitchen window. He sipped his coffee, observing her every move with detached amusement. In his mind, Karen had already walked into her own trap. All he had to do now was wait and watch the show unfold. Karen's obsession with Evan's backyard had reached a boiling point. For weeks, she had been consumed by the mystery of what lay beyond those tall hedges. She couldn't shake the feeling that Evan was hiding something important, enough to justify her relentless pursuit. Her nights were spent lying awake, imagining all sorts of scenarios. Was he growing illegal plants? Running some kind of secret operation? Or worse, was he plotting against the neighborhood? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that uncovering the truth was her duty, not just as an HOA member, but as a protector of the community. On this particular Saturday morning, Karen woke up early, her mind racing with plans. She glanced at the clock. It was barely 6 a.m., but she knew Evan would be gone by now. He had a habit of leaving the house around 5:30 to run errands or work from a nearby coffee shop. This gave her the perfect window of opportunity. Without wasting another moment, she tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake her husband, who was blissfully unaware of her schemes. Grabbing the ladder from the garage, she loaded it into her car and drove toward Maple Lane, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. As she pulled up to Evan's house, Karen parked her car a few houses down to avoid drawing attention. She glanced around cautiously, making sure no one was watching. Satisfied that the coast was clear, she retrieved the ladder and carried it to the edge of Evan's property. The hedges loomed before her, their dense foliage forming an impenetrable wall. But Karen wasn't deterred. She leaned the ladder against the fence, positioning it carefully so she could climb high enough to see over the hedge. Before ascending, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she might discover. "This is for the good of the neighborhood," she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself that her actions were justified. With that, she placed her foot on the first rung and began climbing, her movements slow and deliberate. What Karen didn't realize was that Evan had anticipated this exact scenario long before she arrived. When he first moved into the house, he knew that living quietly in a neighborhood like this meant dealing with nosy neighbors. And Karen, with her clipboard and constant complaints, had been on his radar from day one. Over time, he had observed her patterns, her late-night walks past his house, the way she lingered near his fence when she thought no one was looking. It didn't take a genius to figure out that she would eventually try to peek into his yard, so Evan had prepared accordingly. The perimeter of his property was rigged with subtle yet effective defenses, designed to discourage trespassers without causing harm. One of these measures was a pressure-sensitive mat hidden beneath the mulch near the base of the fence. Anyone standing on it would trigger a mechanism that caused the ladder to shift slightly backward, destabilizing whoever was climbing it. Evan had tested the system multiple times to ensure it worked flawlessly, and now it was about to be put to the test. As Karen climbed higher, her confidence grew. She was almost at the top, her fingers gripping the rungs tightly as she strained to peer over the hedge. Just a few more inches and she'd finally see what Evan had been hiding all this time. But then, as she shifted her weight onto the next rung, she felt the ladder wobble beneath her. Startled, she froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What was that?" she whispered, glancing down nervously. The ground seemed impossibly far away now, and her palms began to sweat. Unbeknownst to Karen, the pressure-sensitive mat had activated the moment she stepped onto it. The ladder, which appeared sturdy and secure, was mounted on a smooth track embedded in the pavement. As the mechanism engaged, the base of the ladder slid backward ever so slightly, creating just enough instability to throw Karen off balance. At first, the movement was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her panic. Her grip tightened on the rungs as she tried to steady herself, but the damage was already done. The ladder tilted further, and with a gasp, Karen lost her footing. Gravity took over, pulling her downward in a sudden, ungraceful tumble. She landed with a thud in a patch of soft mulch that Evan had strategically placed there, a small act of kindness to cushion any falls. Though shaken, she was otherwise unharmed. For a moment, Karen lay sprawled on the ground, dazed and humiliated. Her pride stung more than her body as she realized what had happened. She had walked, or rather, climbed, right into Evan's trap. But her embarrassment quickly turned to anger when she noticed something else. A sign planted directly in front of her face. It read, "Trespassers will be photographed." Above the sign, a small camera blinked innocently, its lens pointed directly at her. Karen's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Not only had she fallen flat on her back in broad daylight, but the entire incident had been captured on film. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt and leaves off her clothes, her face burning with shame. How could she have been so careless? And worse, how was she going to explain this to the neighbors if word got out? Meanwhile, inside his house, Evan watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. From his kitchen window, he had a perfect view of Karen's failed attempt to invade his privacy. He sipped his coffee, chuckling softly as he replayed the footage on his laptop. The motion sensors had triggered the camera the moment Karen stepped onto the mat, capturing every second of her misadventure. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was someone who prided herself on enforcing rules only to break them herself in the most absurd way possible. Evan had no intention of using the footage maliciously. He valued his privacy too much to engage in petty revenge. Still, he couldn't deny the poetic justice of the situation. Karen had spent months accusing him of violating HOA guidelines, yet here she was, trespassing on his property and risking injury in the process. If nothing else, the incident served as a reminder that boundaries existed for a reason, and crossing them often came with consequences. As Karen gathered her things and hurried back to her car, Evan turned off the camera and returned to his morning routine. He felt a sense of calm knowing that his defenses had worked exactly as intended. The neighborhood would likely hear whispers of what happened, but Evan didn't care. To him, the ordeal was proof that sometimes the best response to intrusion wasn't confrontation, it was preparation. And in this case, preparation had paid off beautifully. Little did Karen know her fall from the ladder would mark the beginning of the end of her reign as the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Her reputation, once untouchable, was about to take a hit she hadn't anticipated. But for now, Evan simply smiled to himself, content in the knowledge that his sanctuary remained safe, and that karma had a way of finding those who meddled where they didn't belong. Karen's fall from the ladder was a moment that would soon ripple through the neighborhood like wildfire. But in the immediate aftermath, she was too mortified to think about anything beyond her own embarrassment. As she stumbled to her feet, brushing mulch and dirt off her clothes, her mind raced with thoughts of how to salvage the situation. She glanced around nervously, half expecting Evan to burst out of his house and confront her. But the street remained eerily quiet, save for the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Her eyes darted back to the sign planted in front of her. Trespassers will be photographed. The words mocked her, each letter seeming to grow larger in her mind as she processed their meaning. Above it, the small camera blinked innocently, its unblinking lens capturing every second of her humiliation. Karen felt a surge of anger mixed with panic. How dare Evan set up such a trap? Who did he think he was, turning his property into some kind of fortress? And what was she supposed to do now that she'd been caught red-handed? For a brief moment, Karen considered storming over to Evan's front door and demanding an explanation, or better yet, accusing him of creating hazardous conditions on his property. But common sense quickly kicked in. She knew she had no leg to stand on, not when she had been the one trespassing. Besides, the last thing she wanted was for Evan to see her like this, disheveled, humiliated, and utterly defeated. Instead, she grabbed the ladder, dragging it back toward her car with as much dignity as she could muster. The drive home was agonizing. Each bump in the road seemed to echo her inner turmoil, and the sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror only deepened her shame. Her hair was messy, her face flushed, and there were bits of mulch clinging to her clothes that she hadn't noticed earlier. Worst of all, she couldn't shake the image of that blinking camera. What if Evan decided to share the footage with the HOA board? Or worse, what if he posted it online? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Karen had built her reputation on being the picture of propriety, the woman who always followed the rules. And now, she had been caught breaking them in the most absurd way imaginable. Determined not to let the incident ruin her standing in the neighborhood, Karen resolved to take action. That afternoon, she drafted a formal complaint against Evan, alleging that his property posed a safety hazard. She described the slippery ladder track and the dangerous placement of his hedges, conveniently omitting any mention of why she had been climbing the ladder in the first place. By the time she finished typing, the document was several pages long, filled with dramatic language and exaggerated claims. It was a masterpiece of deflection, designed to shift the blame entirely onto Evan. The next day, Karen submitted her complaint to the HOA board, requesting an emergency meeting to address the matter. She made sure to arrive early, armed with copies of her report and a rehearsed speech outlining Evan's alleged violations. As she sat at the conference table, surrounded by other board members, she felt a flicker of confidence returning. Surely, they would see things her way. After all, she had dedicated countless hours to enforcing HOA guidelines and maintaining order in the neighborhood. Why should this be any different? But Evan wasn't about to let Karen's theatrics go unchallenged. He arrived at the meeting calm and composed, carrying a folder of his own. Inside were screenshots from the security camera footage, clearly showing Karen climbing the ladder, triggering the mechanism and falling into the mulch. There was also evidence of her repeated attempts to spy on his property. Photos of her peering through gaps in the hedge, lingering near his fence late at night, and even knocking on his door under false pretenses. Evan had documented everything, leaving no room for doubt about Karen's behavior. When it was his turn to speak, Evan addressed the board with quiet authority. "I understand the importance of following HOA guidelines," he began, his tone measured and respectful. "But I also believe in setting boundaries to protect my privacy. Ms. Thompson has made numerous attempts to invade my space, despite my repeated efforts to discourage her. Yesterday's incident was the culmination of her actions, and unfortunately, it resulted in her injury." Evan paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "While I regret that she fell, I must point out that the ladder she used did not belong to me, nor did she have permission to climb it onto my property. Furthermore, the mechanisms in place were designed to deter trespassers without causing harm. Any injuries sustained were the result of her own recklessness, not negligence on my part." He then presented the footage, playing it on a laptop for the board to see. The room fell silent as everyone watched Karen teeter on the ladder before tumbling into the mulch. Some members exchanged uneasy glances while others struggled to suppress smirks. When the video ended, Evan closed his laptop and added, "I hope this clears up any misunderstandings about what happened. My priority has always been to maintain a peaceful and private environment, not to create hazards." Karen, who had been listening with growing horror, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? The evidence was undeniable. She had trespassed, fallen, and been caught on camera doing so. Any attempt to deny it would only make her look worse. The board deliberated briefly before reaching a decision. They acknowledged that Evan's hedges exceeded the permitted height and requested that he trim them slightly to comply with HOA guidelines. However, they dismissed Karen's claims of hazardous conditions, citing her trespassing as the root cause of the incident. To add insult to injury, they issued a stern warning to Karen about respecting residents' boundaries and reminded her that filing baseless complaints could lead to disciplinary action. As the meeting adjourned, Karen slunk out of the room, her head bowed in defeat. For the first time in years, she found herself on the receiving end of judgmental stares and whispered comments. Neighbors who had once feared her wrath now regarded her with a mix of amusement and pity. Some even joked about the infamous ladder incident, dubbing it Karen's great fall behind her back. Meanwhile, Evan returned home feeling vindicated but not triumphant. He hadn't sought revenge or public humiliation. He simply wanted to protect his privacy and ensure that others respected it. The outcome of the meeting proved that justice, and perhaps karma, had a way of finding those who meddled where they didn't belong. In the days that followed, Karen retreated from her role as HOA enforcer, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and skipping meetings altogether. The once mighty queen of the association had been dethroned, her reputation tarnished by her own actions. And though she eventually moved away, muttering about injustice until the day she left, the memory of her tumble from the ladder lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. For Evan, life returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible, in a neighborhood like this. He continued tending to his garden, occasionally inviting curious neighbors over to admire its beauty. His clever defenses became a running joke among friends, who teased him about his high-tech security measures. But for Evan, the ordeal reinforced his belief in setting healthy boundaries. While he valued community, he also cherished his solitude, knowing that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And whenever he passed the spot where Karen had fallen, he couldn't help but smile, grateful for the peace and quiet he had fought so hard to preserve. The aftermath of Karen's infamous ladder incident rippled through the neighborhood like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves of gossip, whispers, and even a few chuckles. It wasn't long before everyone knew what had happened, or, at least their version of it. Some claimed they saw Karen climbing the ladder themselves, while others swore they heard her shouting obscenities after falling. A few imaginative souls even speculated that Evan had rigged his yard with booby traps, worthy of an action movie, complete with tripwires and hidden pits. While these stories were exaggerated, one thing was certain. Karen's reputation as the all-knowing, all-controlling HOA enforcer had taken a massive hit. At first, Karen tried to downplay the incident. She avoided eye contact with neighbors, pretending not to notice the smirks or hear the hushed conversations whenever she passed by. But avoiding people only fueled their curiosity. Instead of fading into obscurity, Karen became the subject of endless speculation, and not always in a kind way. Her once untouchable image as the neighborhood watchdog began to crack under the weight of ridicule. Even those who had previously feared her started to see her in a new light, as someone who had gotten exactly what she deserved. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat gracefully. To her, the HOA board's decision felt like a personal betrayal. How could they side with Evan, a man who had clearly gone out of his way to make his property inaccessible? Surely they should have understood that her actions, no matter how misguided, were motivated by concern for the community. Or so she told herself. In reality, Karen's pride wouldn't allow her to admit fault. Instead, she doubled down on her efforts to discredit Evan, determined to prove that he was the real problem. She began spreading rumors, hinting that Evan's garden might contain illegal plants or that his security measures were far more dangerous than anyone realized. She even suggested that his cameras violated privacy laws, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had been installed solely to protect his own property. but her attempts to turn public opinion against him fell flat. Most neighbors were too amused by her fall from grace to take her accusations seriously. Besides, Evan had already proven himself to be level-headed and reasonable during the HOA meeting. His calm demeanor and undeniable evidence had left little room for doubt about who was truly at fault. Frustrated, but undeterred, Karen decided to escalate her campaign. She drafted another formal complaint, this time accusing Evan of harassment. According to her, the sign warning trespassers would be photographed constituted a threat, and the presence of cameras near his fence amounted to invasive surveillance. She argued passionately that Evan's actions created a hostile environment for anyone living nearby. However, her claims lacked substance and the HOA board dismissed them almost immediately. By now, they were tired of Karen's antics and eager to move on from the drama she brought to every meeting. As the weeks went by, Karen's influence within the HOA continued to wane. Board members stopped seeking her input on minor issues, and her suggestions were often met with polite indifference. Neighbors who had once sought her approval for home improvements or party invitations no longer bothered. Even her closest allies began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose behavior had become increasingly erratic. For Karen, the isolation was unbearable. She had spent years cultivating her role as the neighborhood authority figure, and losing it felt like losing a part of herself. Meanwhile, Evan carried on with his life as if nothing had changed. He tended to his garden, worked remotely from his cozy home office, and occasionally chatted with friendly neighbors who stopped by to admire his flowers. Though he noticed the shift in Karen's status, he didn't dwell on it. To him, the entire ordeal had been less about defeating Karen and more about asserting his right to live peacefully. Still, he couldn't deny feeling a sense of relief knowing that her constant surveillance had finally come to an end. One day, as Evan was pruning his roses, he overheard two neighbors talking near the sidewalk. They were laughing about Karen's fall, recounting the story with animated gestures and playful exaggerations. One of them joked, "I heard she landed in a patch of poison ivy." The other responded, "If she did, it probably served her right." Evan smiled to himself, shaking his head slightly. He didn't encourage the gossip, but he understood why people found humor in the situation. After months of tension and nosiness, Karen's downfall had provided a rare moment of levity in an otherwise quiet neighborhood. Despite the lightheartedness surrounding the incident, some residents felt sympathy for Karen. They recognized that her behavior stemmed from a desire to maintain order, even if her methods were misguided. A few even reached out to her privately, offering support or inviting her to social events in hopes of easing her transition back into the community. But Karen rejected their attempts, retreating further into herself. She became increasingly bitter, convinced that everyone was conspiring against her. Her once pristine lawn grew over with weeds, and her curtains remained drawn most days. It was as though she had given up, not just on her role in the HOA, but on engaging with the world altogether. Eventually, Karen made the decision to sell her house and move away. The process was swift and secretive, as if she wanted to leave, without drawing attention. On moving day, a truck arrived early in the morning and workers quickly loaded her belongings. Karen herself stayed inside until the last minute, emerging only when it was time to lock the door behind her. As she walked to her car, suitcase in hand, she glanced around furtively, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be watching. Then, without saying goodbye, she drove off, leaving Maple Lane and its judgmental stares behind forever. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief when Karen's house sold. New owners moved in shortly afterward, transforming the space into a warm and welcoming home. Unlike Karen, they embraced the community spirit, hosting barbecues and decorating their porch for holidays. Their arrival marked a fresh start for the street, signaling the end of an era dominated by rules, complaints, and unnecessary drama. For Evan, Karen's departure was both satisfying and bittersweet. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that his boundaries had been respected and upheld. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel sorry for Karen. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what truly mattered: connection, kindness, and mutual respect. Her obsession with control had isolated her from the very people she claimed to care about, ultimately leading to her downfall. Still, Evan chose to focus on the positives. With Karen gone, the neighborhood seemed lighter, freer. Conversations flowed more easily and laughter echoed through the streets more often. People waved to each other without fear of judgment, and children played outside without worrying about strict guidelines. It was as though a heavy cloud had lifted, allowing the sun to shine through once again. Evan continued nurturing his garden, which flourished under his care. He expanded his flower beds, added a small pond, and even built a pergola draped with climbing vines. Occasionally, curious neighbors asked if they could tour his backyard, and he happily obliged, sharing stories about his favorite plants and offering tips for growing their own. His once mysterious sanctuary became a source of joy and inspiration for the community, proving that beauty could thrive when given space to grow. Though Karen's shadow lingered in the memories of those who had lived through her reign, her absence allowed the neighborhood to heal and rebuild. Life on Maple Lane returned to normal, or perhaps something better than normal. It was a place where people looked out for one another, celebrated differences, and valued harmony over control. And, for Evan, that was worth every ounce of effort he had put into defending his peace. With Karen's departure, the neighborhood of Maple Lane entered a new chapter, one defined by calmness, camaraderie, and an unspoken agreement to let people live their lives without unnecessary interference. The tension that had lingered for so long seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by a sense of ease and lightheartedness. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen's rules now found themselves free to express their individuality. Front yards became canvases for creativity. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, colorful garden gnomes peeked out from flower beds, and quirky hand-painted signs welcomed visitors with cheerful messages. It was as though the entire street had collectively exhaled. Evan, too, noticed the change. His mornings were quieter now, uninterrupted by the sound of footsteps pacing near his fence or the click of a camera lens aimed in his direction. He could sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise filter through his hedges without feeling like he was being watched. The peace he had fought so hard to protect was finally his to enjoy fully. Yet, despite the newfound tranquility, Evan didn't retreat into isolation. Instead, he embraced the opportunity to connect with his neighbors in ways he hadn't before. One Saturday afternoon, inspired by the positive shift in the community, Evan decided to host an open house in his backyard. He sent handwritten invitations to everyone on the block, inviting them to explore the garden that had sparked so much curiosity over the years. At first, some neighbors hesitated, unsure if Evan truly meant it or if this was some kind of elaborate prank. But when they arrived and saw him standing at the gate, smiling warmly and offering lemonade, their doubts melted away. The tour was a revelation. As guests wandered through winding pathways lined with vibrant blooms and exotic plants, Evan shared stories about how he had designed the space. He explained the purpose of the motion sensors, just a harmless deterrent, he joked, and pointed out his favorite flowers, including a rare orchid he had nurtured for years. Children giggled as they chased butterflies while adults marveled at the intricate trellises covered in climbing roses. For many, it was their first glimpse into Evan's world, and they left with a newfound appreciation for the man behind the hedges. What surprised Evan most, however, was the way people responded to him afterward. Once seen as a recluse, he was now regarded as a valued member of the community. Neighbors stopped by more often, not to snoop, but to chat or ask for gardening advice. Some even brought him small gifts, a jar of homemade jam, a potted plant, or a note thanking him for opening his home. These gestures touched Evan deeply, reminding him of the importance of connection, even for someone who cherished solitude. As the weeks turned into months, life on Maple Lane settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA meetings, once dominated by Karen's complaints, became shorter and less contentious. Board members focused on practical matters, such as organizing community cleanup days or planning holiday events. Without Karen's constant scrutiny, homeowners felt empowered to make decisions about their properties without fear of backlash. The result was a neighborhood that felt more diverse and dynamic, yet still cohesive. Karen's absence also prompted reflection among those who had known her best or thought they did. Some admitted privately that they had enabled her behavior, either by staying silent or going along with her demands. Others realized how much stress she had caused, not just for Evan, but for everyone. Her obsession with control had created a culture of fear, where people prioritized avoiding conflict over fostering genuine relationships. In her absence, they vowed to do better, to be kinder, more understanding, and less judgmental. Even Karen's old house played a role in the neighborhood's transformation. The new owners, a young family with 2 energetic kids and a golden retriever, quickly became beloved fixtures on the street. They threw lively parties, baked cookies for their neighbors, and decorated their yard with whimsical touches that made passers-by smile. Their presence reminded everyone that homes weren't just structures, they were places where memories were made and shared. For Evan, the changes reinforced his belief in setting healthy boundaries while remaining open to connection. He continued to maintain his garden, tweaking its design here and there to keep it fresh and interesting. Occasionally, he added new features, like a small bench tucked under a shady tree or a fountain that bubbled softly in the background. These additions weren't just for his enjoyment. They were invitations for others to share in the beauty he had created. But perhaps the most significant change was within Evan himself. The ordeal with Karen had taught him resilience and patience, qualities he hadn't fully appreciated until they were tested. He learned that standing up for oneself didn't have to mean shutting others out, and that sometimes the best way to resolve conflict was through understanding rather than confrontation. While he still valued his privacy, he no longer felt the need to guard it so fiercely. Instead, he struck a balance between solitude and sociability, finding joy in both. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over his garden, Evan sat on his porch reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about Karen, how her relentless pursuit of control had ultimately led to her undoing. He thought about the neighbors who had rallied around him, proving that kindness could triumph over pettiness. And he thought about his garden, which had become a symbol of perseverance and peace. In that moment, Evan felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the outcome of the latter incident, but for the lessons it had taught him. Life, he realized, was full of unexpected twists and turns. Sometimes you stumbled, other times you soared. What mattered most was how you responded to those moments, and whether you allowed them to shape you for the better. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Evan leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that he had built something meaningful, not just in his garden, but in his relationships with those around him. He smiled to himself, thinking about how far things had come since the day Karen fell off the ladder. It was a story he would likely never tell anyone, except maybe someday, when the time was right. For now, it was enough to know that justice, and karma, had a way of finding those who meddled where they didn't belong. And for Evan, that was all the closure he needed.